When I was a kid, I had one particularly terrifying experience in the house where I grew up. We moved in when I was around 4 years old, so I barely remember the place we lived before that. We stayed in that home for a full decade, up until I turned 14. I have lots of good memories there. It was the kind of place that truly felt like ours. Right before I started high school, we relocated to another state, which was its own kind of nightmare. But that's not what this story is about. What matters is this. In the backyard, there was a treehouse. The previous owner had built it for his kids. According to my parents, it was one of the reasons they bought the place, something they thought my older brother Kyle and I would enjoy. He was 2 years older than me. We both loved it. For years, it was our little world. But of course, as we got older, we eventually outgrew it. By the time I was 12, I didn't hang out there much anymore. Still, I was a bit of a rebellious kid around that age, constantly arguing with my parents, getting into trouble at school, acting out like your typical moody preteen. One weekend, my dad grounded me again. The school had called home about my behavior. Furious and overdramatic, I grabbed a pillow and blanket and decided to move out for the night, straight into the treehouse. I'd done it before, and by that point, my parents didn't even bother to argue. It had become my go-to protest. That night, I snuck my Nintendo DS with me, even though I wasn't allowed to play games while grounded. I stayed up for hours playing Animal Crossing until I started dozing off. But I hadn't been asleep long when I heard something that snapped me back to reality. A voice. "Tommy, are you up there?" It was a man's voice, deep and calm. At first, I thought it was my dad. But something felt off. I didn't answer. My heart began to race. Then I heard the creaking of wood. Someone was climbing the ladder. A moment later, I saw the top of a head appear through the floor opening. It was too dark to see a face, just the outline of someone's head and shoulders. "There you are," the voice said. "Dad?" I asked, hesitantly. But that was it. No reply. Just silence. For about 20 seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't tell if my eyes were adjusting to the dark or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But everything in me knew that wasn't my father. Then I panicked. I bolted to the window and screamed, "Dad," as loud as I could. A light flicked on in my parents' bedroom almost instantly. And just as it did, I heard someone scramble back down the ladder. Within seconds, both of my parents rushed outside. The first thing my dad said was, "That wasn't me. I swear, I never left the house." And the thing is, they believed me. This wasn't one of those stories where the kid gets brushed off like they're imagining things. They knew I was serious. My uncle was still an active duty police officer at the time, so my dad called him right away. A report was filed the next day, but there wasn't much to go on. Just a man's voice, the silhouette of a head, and the fact that the stranger knew my name. Nothing ever came of it. And after that night, I never slept in that treehouse again. My dad spent a long time convinced it was someone from across the street, a neighbor maybe, but he never had proof. For years, I'd listen closely anytime someone around the neighborhood said hi to me, trying to match that voice, that tone, that presence, but I never could. And to this day, that night remains an unsolved, terrifying riddle in my mind. Lately, a memory I've kept buried for years has been surfacing more and more. My youngest son, Luke, just started college. I'm beyond proud of him. But the house feels emptier than ever. Too quiet. When your kids are little, you crave silence. But when that silence finally arrives, it feels unnatural. Maybe it's normal to start remembering odd moments from your children's younger years during transitions like this. At least, that's what people tell you. One particular memory keeps coming back. Luke was about 8 at the time, and I still can't fully explain what happened. I've been a carpenter my whole life, building, shaping, fixing. I used to have way more energy and took on a lot of personal projects. One of my favorites was a treehouse I built for Luke in our backyard. Not just a platform either. It was a real little house with wooden walls, a roof, stairs, solid craftsmanship. I wanted it to be his own special world. My wife, Christy, was nervous at first. She thought it was too high. But Luke was always climbing trees anyway, so I told her this would actually be safer with real stairs. She eventually agreed. Luke absolutely loved it. Our property sits at the end of a dead-end street, right against the woods. That privacy was the main reason we bought the place. I built the treehouse in a way that I could see the stairs from our bedroom window. Not inside, but enough to know if something went wrong. For a while, everything was completely normal. Luke spent a healthy amount of time up there. His older brother had outgrown it. Then one day, Luke started talking about someone named Jake, his friend. No one around had a kid named Jake, so we assumed he was imaginary. Christy thought it was cute. I was more skeptical. Luke had never had imaginary friends before. But 8-year-olds go through strange phases, so I let it slide. Still, I noticed something odd. Luke was spending more and more time in the treehouse, but he wasn't bringing toys. He'd just go sit up there playing with Jake. I had told him not to carry anything up there alone for safety reasons. One day, I asked him about Jake. His reaction caught me off guard. He told me Jake didn't like being talked about, that he was shy. And apparently, Jake never wanted to come inside the house. He preferred the treehouse. That struck me as strange. Imaginary friends usually follow the child around. They're in the child's mind, after all. I looked it up and found that some kids do attach their imaginary friends to specific places. Still, Christy and I both felt unsettled. But we weren't the kind of parents who kept our kids indoors out of fear. As long as Luke was doing well in school, he could play as he liked. On weekends, he'd ride bikes with neighborhood kids, run around. He was a good kid, never got into fights, which is why we were stunned when he came home one Saturday evening with a black eye. I cleaned him up and asked what happened. He wouldn't say. I promised I wouldn't be mad, and then he told me he got into a fight with Jake. I was speechless. It took me a second to realize he meant his imaginary friend. I told him to quit pretending, but he started crying and ran to his room. Christy was convinced he'd gotten into it with another kid and was too embarrassed to say so. She begged me to take down the treehouse, but I had put so much of myself into that thing. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. I said I'd talk to Luke, but he stayed in his room all day. The next morning, I climbed up to the treehouse to take a look myself. What I found disturbed me. Scattered on the floor were a pair of worn-out sneakers and some old socks. Dirty, ripped, clearly not Luke's. Not even hand-me-downs. We'd given all of those away long ago. There were also empty food wrappers, plastic cutlery bags, and used paper plates. But the walls, that's what really got me. Someone had drawn crude pencil sketches of animals all over them. A fox, a bear, a deer, and one massive spider with a human-like face scribbled out with heavy black lines. It looked wrong. I rushed back down and asked Luke what all of it meant. He calmly told me Jake gets cranky when he's hungry, so he brings him snacks. The socks and shoes? Those were Jake's. He forgets stuff a lot, Luke said. That was it. I told him he wasn't allowed up there anymore. I was sure he'd found those things somewhere and created a whole story around them. Something about it didn't sit right. Christy started getting seriously worried. We even considered speaking to a child psychologist. Then one evening, I saw something. From our bedroom window, I noticed movement near the treehouse. I got angry. I thought Luke had disobeyed me. But what I saw next made my blood run cold. Another child was climbing down the steps. Thin, dirty clothes, pale. It wasn't Luke, and it wasn't any neighborhood kid. He looked half-starved. I ran outside yelling, trying to stop him, but the boy bolted, sprinted into the woods with unbelievable speed. Within seconds, he was gone. Christy called every parent on the street. All the kids were home. We called the police. They searched the woods for over an hour. Nothing. No missing children. No footprints. No signs. With my permission, they questioned Luke, and what he said shook us both. Jake, he explained, was a magical boy who lived in the woods with animal friends. A bear, a fox, a deer. Every time he visited, he'd ask Luke to leave home and come live in the forest. When Luke refused, Jake would start making strange sounds and get angry. Why he never told us any of this before, I still don't know. I felt like I had failed him. How had I let him play there unsupervised? The police came back a few more times, ran more searches, but Jake was never seen again. Christy believes Jake wasn't real, just a figment of a child's imagination, or maybe something worse. I don't believe in the supernatural, but honestly, her explanation is just as frightening as the other possibility. Because if Jake was real, then something or someone could still be out there, hiding in those woods.
This happened just a few weeks ago, and it's still burned into my mind like it was yesterday. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood in Delaware, but I'm currently attending college in California. I went back home for a few days during fall break. I like visiting home, even though it can feel a little stifling sometimes. My parents are pretty traditional, in more ways than one, and they still struggle to accept that I'm an adult now. Because of that, I've learned how to sneak around when I need to. Not something I'm proud of, but it's become second nature. When I was a kid, they built me a treehouse in the front yard. These days it's worn down, but still sturdy. Because of its height and the surrounding branches, you can't really see it unless you know exactly where to look. Back then, it was my escape. The Saturday before I was supposed to fly back to school, my parents went to a formal event and weren't expected home until late. I didn't want to get caught sneaking around outside, so I grabbed a few things and climbed up into the old treehouse. It was chilly out. I could see my breath in the air. I sat quietly, watching the sunset, letting my mind drift through memories, school stress, the future. Time passed quickly, and before I knew it, it was completely dark, just like I wanted. Then I noticed something strange. The lights inside the house turned on. I froze. I was supposed to be the only one home. My heart started pounding. My instincts immediately screamed that something was wrong. A few seconds later, I saw movement in the yard. 3 figures in hooded sweatshirts were creeping across the property. And then, to my horror, the front door opened from the inside. That's when it hit me. Someone was robbing my house. It didn't feel real. I stayed completely still, watching in disbelief. One of the men stayed outside, slowly pacing around the yard. Then I realized I was holding my phone. I quickly dialed 911 and whispered what was happening before ending the call. But just as I went to tuck the phone away, the glow from the screen must have caught someone's attention. The man in the yard looked up, directly toward the trees. I ducked down, heart racing, but it was too late. "Hey!" he shouted. They knew I was there. Peeking through a gap in the wooden wall, I saw him walking toward the tree. Then he started climbing. Panic surged through me. I shouted that the police were on their way, hoping it would scare him off. It didn't. He kept climbing, clearly intent on reaching me. I grabbed the first thing I could find, something heavy and glass. I threw it at him with everything I had. It hit him square in the head and shattered. He swore loudly and lost his grip, falling off the ladder. It wasn't a long drop, but it seemed to be enough. He stumbled back, cursed again, then ran toward the house. I heard him shout something to the others, and a moment later, all four of them bolted out the back, disappearing into the night. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might pass out. About 3 minutes later, the police arrived. I climbed down slowly, shaking from adrenaline and fear. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words kept tangling up in my mouth. My parents pulled into the driveway shortly after. Thankfully, they stayed calm. The officers said it looked like a planned break-in. They probably thought no one would be home. I don't even want to imagine what could have happened if that man had made it to the top. I'm back in California now, but I haven't slept well since. The thought that my parents are still living there alone keeps me up some nights. And I just hope, with everything I've got, that those men never come back.
When I was around 9 or 10 years old, my dad landed a high-paying job that meant we had to move from our quiet little spot in rural Pennsylvania to an upscale neighborhood in Brookmont, Maryland. I say had to, but honestly, my parents were thrilled. Within weeks, we left our run-down home behind and settled into a massive house in one of the nicest areas in the state. You might wonder how I felt about it. Truth is, I didn't mind much. I'd always been a quiet kid, not particularly close to anyone, so I wasn't leaving any friends behind. My parents later told me they hoped this move would give me a fresh start, but I wasn't focused on any of that. The house was enormous, and even as a kid, I could sense that we had just stepped into a very different kind of life. I won't bore you with all the house details, just the important bits. I had 2 older brothers, Sean and Harold, and behind the house was this giant backyard with a maze of thick bushes, perfect for games. But the real centerpiece, a huge wooden structure built high in the trees at the edge of the property. We called it the Treehouse, though Treehouse doesn't really do it justice. It was more like a wooden fortress, stretching across 6 or 7 trees, 3 full levels, solid staircases instead of ladders. Whoever built it clearly knew what they were doing. My brothers and I spent nearly every afternoon out there. As time passed, though, my brothers grew older and moved on to other things. Eventually, I was the only one still playing out there. I tried convincing them to join me again, but they weren't interested. Then, one day, while I was up in the treehouse, I found a piece of paper folded neatly in a corner. I'll never forget what it said. "Hello, I'm Mr. Marshmallow. Nice to meet you. What's your name?" I was thrilled. I figured one of my brothers had created a game for me to enjoy, so I decided to play along. Strangely, there was now a stack of blank papers sitting in the corner. It hadn't been there before. I grabbed a marker, wrote a reply, and left it exactly where I'd found the note. That evening, I wanted to ask my brothers which of them was behind Mr. Marshmallow, but I was afraid they'd end the game if I brought it up, so I stayed quiet. Each day after school, I'd rush back out to the treehouse, and without fail, there would be a new message waiting for me. At first, the notes were playful, innocent, just like something my brothers might write. But over time, the questions began to shift. They became strange, a little too personal. Things like, "When do you usually play outside?" and "What do you eat for breakfast?" Odd, but I still assumed it was just a game. Until one message hit a little too close. "Which window is yours in the house?" That one gave me chills, but I still didn't say anything. I wrote back with an answer, trying to convince myself it was harmless. Then came another note that asked, "What do your pajamas smell like?" That was it. I ran inside and confronted my brothers, expecting one of them to crack a smile and admit it. But they didn't. Instead, they laughed at me, said they had no clue what I was talking about, told me there was no Mr. Marshmallow, that I was making things up again. I was crushed. I didn't go to my parents. Instead, I made a plan. I'd catch them in the act. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. I froze. I've never been great with the dark, and that sound, I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep.
In the morning, I pulled back my curtains and nearly screamed. Dozens of marshmallows were stuck to the outside of my window. It had to be my brother's. I was sure of it. So I decided that night I'd stay awake and catch them red-handed. I kept quiet about the marshmallows all day, didn't mention a thing. And that night, when the tapping returned, I jumped out of bed, yanked the curtain open, and it wasn't one of my brothers. There, staring at me through the glass, was a man I'd never seen before. His hair was thin and patchy, his skin pale and sagging. His eyes gleamed yellow like tarnished gold, and his teeth, rotten, dark, crooked. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile you don't forget. I screamed as loud as I could. My parents came running, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The police came. They searched the entire yard, even the treehouse and the woods behind the house. Nothing. A few neighbors had come out after hearing the commotion, and they looked horrified when they heard what had happened. I told them everything. The notes, the marshmallows, the face in the window. They took the messages as evidence, but I doubt anything ever came of it. The man was never found. My parents banned me from going back to the treehouse, but honestly, I didn't need convincing. I never wanted to set foot in that thing again. Years have passed since then. I've moved out, started my own life, but my parents still live in that house, and every time I visit, I catch myself staring at the trees in the back. Longer than I probably should. That memory still haunts me. It's one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me.